For African Methodists as a whole, it really highlights a relatively unknown chapter of our denominational history. There are, many people who are unaware of the connection that the AME Church has had with indigenous people. And so just on a general level for African Methodists, it helps to shed light on that very real history. And it's just also important for us as Americans to know that the histories that we know are often more integrated and interwoven than we sometimes think. Mm-hmm. We think in terms of African American history, Native American history, religious history, but this book helps to bring all of those elements together because that was how people experienced that time period. In terms of Richard Allen, Allen was, at this point, seeking to purchase his freedom from his master, Stokely Sturgis. And one of the jobs he did in order to earn money was hauling salt between Pennsylvania and Delaware. And one of the sites that he went to was George Washington's encampment at Valley Forge. And so Allen himself, is a part of this, complex fabric of the Revolution. He is present at this really critical moment in Revolutionary War history, being at Valley Forge. And I posit in the book that, there were Native people at Valley Forge at the time that Allen went there. So I don't know for sure that he met this person or that person, but I put him in that context so that we can think about, as Allen is having these experiences, what might he be thinking about? How might interacting with indigenous people have affected his view on Methodism, which was still, emerging at that time. The Methodist Episcopal Church, which gets formally established in 1784, this was initially the denomination to which Allen belonged. And as is, well known, eventually he began to see some less than Christian behavior among the white Methodists at St. George's Church in Philadelphia. And he was disappointed in this, not only as a black man, so of course he was offended to be discriminated against as a black man, but he was also disappointed as someone who was really there from the beginning of the Methodist movement and knew what it was supposed to be. And so when he saw these white Methodists behaving in this way, he said, not only is this, offensive to me as a black man, but this is offensive to me as a Methodist, as a genuine, Wesleyan. And so what I argue is that when he does eventually found the AME Church, he deliberately doesn't intend for it to be an exclusionary institution. It's not only for black people, because otherwise, how is that any different than what the Methodist Episcopal Church was doing? So I view Allen really as trying to reclaim genuine, authentic Wesleyanism, which was supposed to be, egalitarian and inclusive and, not putting one group of people above another. So I really view that as foundational to understanding what Allen was trying to do with the AME Church. And that helps to set the stage for the rest of the book. The AME Church was unapologetically an abolitionist institution. It was, very well established that the AME denomination supported abolition. The church in which you and I grew up, Israel AME Church in Albany, New York, was a stop on the Underground Railroad. You have, of course, what happens with Denmark Vesey in Charleston. You have so many other examples of African Methodists and the AME Church standing up against the institution of slavery. And so there's no way that Thomas Sunrise would have joined this church and not been pro-abolition. It just wouldn't happen. So that history, that real deep belief in abolition, I believe, is what draws Thomas Sunrise to the denomination. It certainly didn't turn him off. If it turned him off, he just would have joined, something else from the beginning. But clearly his abolitionist sympathies were well-founded in the AME Church, and he was able to express them in this denomination in a way perhaps he couldn't have done, or he felt he couldn't have done, in a white denomination. So this whole very tumultuous period in American history where the country is really grappling with the issue of slavery and its potential expansion in the West, all of this is an important backdrop to Sunrise's story and helps to explain why he was such an ardent abolitionist, because he, was going through this upheaval and watching it firsthand, and clearly was sympathetic to the plight of African Americans and was willing to throw his lot in with them. The denomination was open to marginalized people of color from various backgrounds, including these indigenous people. So it would be one thing if we were just saying there's one Native person in one random place who was interested in the AME Church, but to have both of these ministers in this critical time doing these, doing this interesting and important work, the fact that you also have this in chapter 1, that you had Richard Allen and John Stewart and Jarena Lee doing the ministries that they did, all of it kind of connects together and points to the fact that in this first century of the AME denomination's existence, that there were deliberate outreach efforts to indigenous people, and that people such as Thomas Sunrise and John Hall, they were receptive to them. And not only receptive, but they were willing to become ordained ministers in the denomination and then spread what they learned and spread African Methodism to these various other communities. So it's important to recognize, certainly for the context of this book, because the rest of the book really focuses on Indian Territory in Oklahoma, but also for African Methodists to recognize even today that we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't think it is odd for an AME church to be among a community that's not African American. It shouldn't be odd for there to be people of, Hispanic background to be AMEs. It shouldn't be odd to have people from whatever community joining the AME church, because that really is our history. That is what that's just what people did. That's not me making it up. This is what people really did in this first century of the AME denomination. They reached out to various people, and we have this more rich and diverse history than I think we give ourselves credit for sometimes. So the African Methodist migration, again, a term I coined, is essentially the AME church following its members wherever they go. So if AME members are migrating to California, the AME church is going to California and establishing churches. If AMEs are going to Indian Territory, well, the church is going there too. And so the AME church really makes an effort to follow its people. And so what happens is, say, a minister like William Paul Quinn gets to an area like Illinois or Missouri, and he finds that there are people there who want to have an AME church. Okay, so say he establishes that congregation, he establishes some others. Well, then every year, those churches are going to have new pastors. And so oftentimes the bishops will assign pastors, sometimes in the region, to those churches, but sometimes pastors from out of that region into those locations. And so that really compels ministers to migrate west, again, as the church is going. As is unfortunately the case, the AME church is integral into every aspect of African American history, African American life, and that includes the race massacre in Tulsa and other massacres that happened later. The Rosewood massacre in Florida happens a few years later, and if I'm not mistaken, there was an AME church in Rosewood as well. So whatever is happening to African Americans writ large, it's happening to the AME church. When African Americans as a whole are under attack, under siege, so is the AME church. So it's really integral in this, it's inextricable. You cannot tell the story of African Americans without telling the story of the AME church. And that is, a powerful, wonderful thing, but it also brings with it these really painful, deadly consequences. So Annie Keel, she is, very much a proponent of this way of thinking, that now that I'm free, I don't have to, abide by what anyone tells me to do. I can make decisions. And one of the decisions that she makes is that she wants to be an African Methodist. I argue in the book that this is for a variety of reasons. There are numerous choices that she could have made. She could have chosen the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which was around. She could have chosen, any number of other denominations. But for her, the fact that the AME Church was an autonomous Black denomination, that it had been that way since its inception, that it had Black bishops, Black general officers, that it boasted some of the most prominent African Americans in the country at this point, people like Henry McNeil Turner, that they were, bishops in the AME Church. Well, he wasn't a bishop yet, but you understand what I'm saying. And so this appealed to her, the fact that AMEs were well known for being proponents of education. They had Wilberforce University, and so they had everything that she would have wanted. Autonomous Black denomination. They have a track record of supporting education and establishing educational institutions. You have that newspaper. You have some of the most prominent African Americans in the country belonging to this denomination. So to her, it made perfect sense that this is what she would seek out. And so I argue in the book that she chose the AME Church for those reasons. By 1878, African Methodist ministers have been working in Indian Territory for almost a decade. And I give, specific statistics in the book, but essentially they are making inroads in all 5 of the tribal nations, the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory. So they have not only reached out to Black indigenous people among the Choctaw and Chickasaw, but they are reaching out in various regions of Indian Territory. And they are really empowering Black indigenous ministers themselves to help them do this. They recognized early on that, yes, we are, African Americans from Arkansas, and so we can come in and bring the church, but we really need to see, some of you and Black indigenous ministers do this work as well. So they really work alongside Black indigenous ministers, and I go into that more in chapter 5, but they work with them to help expand in these communities. So that by the time you get to 1878, there is already enough development that there is a call to make a separate conference for Indian Territory. So prior to that time, all of these churches were under the auspices of the Arkansas Annual Conference, because this is where these ministers were initially coming from. So by the time we get to 1878, there's enough development to justify separating these churches from the Arkansas Annual Conference and establishing their own conference. So this happens in 1879. You get the official establishment of the Indian Mission Annual Conference. And this initial meeting, sets off a whole new phase of AME development in Indian Territory. You have plenty of white people, white clergymen, who are seeking to aid, freedmen, people who had been formerly enslaved. You see many examples of white Northerners coming to the South and assisting freedmen. What you don't see, what I have not seen again, the research may be out there, but I have not seen anyone else, any other white person who joins a Black denomination. And what that means is that he is, as the quote says, subordinating himself to Black ecclesiastical authority. He is placing himself, underneath the Black bishop, who at the time was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. He is saying, where Bishop Turner tells me to go, if he assigns me to this place, I will go. What Bishop Turner tells me to do, I will do. That is what it means to be a pastor in this, in this system. So yes, there are plenty of white people who are assisting freedmen in a variety of ways, but Sisson is the only one that I have seen thus far who is willing to go this far, to really practice what he's preaching in saying that African Americans can maintain their own institutions. I, believe in their ability, their leadership ability, their intelligence. And he's not just saying that, he is proving that by joining the denomination and again, subordinating himself to, Bishop Turner and the other, Black bishop. Really the argument of the book overall is that when Richard Allen establishes the AME Church, he's doing so with the intention of making it an inclusive denomination. And I talked, about that in our first episode. And these ministers in the Indian Mission Annual Conference, they perfectly encapsulate that vision. You have Black Indigenous people from the various tribal nations. You have African Americans from all over the South coming to Indian Territory and ministering in the Indian Mission Annual Conference. You have Sisson, a white man who is, an important part, really a pioneering figure in the establishment of this conference. And so that is the mission. That, I argue, is really what Allen was striving for. He wanted this to be a denomination that really welcomed anyone. He was clear about, that being the purpose. And these ministers, these diverse ministers in the Indian Mission Annual Conference, they really demonstrate that, just looking at them. If you were to, if we had a camera, we could go back in time and we were just to take a snapshot of an annual conference meeting, in 1883 in Indian Territory, you would see, this diverse array of people. You really can't overstate the importance that education held for freed people, African Americans and Black Indigenous people. After the war, after slavery ended, one of the main things that people wanted to do, in addition to, finding their lost family members, was to acquire an education. And as was the case, outside of Indian Territory, just in the American South, schooling was hard. It was hard to have enough funds to have, functioning schools of all levels. You're dealing with people who are at, different educational levels. And so it was a complex process, not to mention the fact that schools were sometimes the target of white vigilante violence, people who did not want to see people of African descent becoming educated. But one of the reasons that I argue in chapter 4, one of the reasons why Black Indigenous people wanted the AME Church to come to Indian Territory was because of the denomination's history of educating people. The fact that the AME Church had really the best educated clergy among, all these denominations. And so when the AME Church does come, almost immediately, they're establishing schools in various forms, whether it's a Sunday school, a day school, and they, certainly go along with the seasons. If, you have a heavy planting season, they would understand, okay, we're not going to have school in those months. But you see really a devotion to education among Black Indigenous people and a real appreciation for it, that the AME Church was bringing that to them in various forms. So one thing about the AME Church is we have our rituals. You know what you are going to recite, what you are going to sing at a district conference, an annual conference, a general conference. And this is a way of, in a way, standardizing the experience. That yes, there will be regional differences depending on what church you attend. Yes, there will be cultural differences. But fundamentally, we're all going to hear, and are we yet alive? We'll all, be reciting the Decalogue and singing Praise God from whom all blessings flow. And so Bishop Turner really does, go about instituting that in the IMAC. And you see that reflected in annual conference minutes. So the bishop always presides over the annual conference. And so if you look at those minutes, you'll see Turner, leading the congregation in a particular song. And oftentimes these are songs that were written by Charles Wesley, who was a prolific hymn writer. And so in this way, Turner and others are able to really enforce in a, an enjoyable way, AME orthodoxy. And for people who may not have, necessarily grown up AME, who may have just joined the church, this is the way to introduce them to what AMEs do, what AMEs believe, what AMEs sing. Because hymns, of course, they contain within them the, the theology.
Sure,
and so you may not be able to, maybe you didn't go to seminary, but you can, listen to these songs, you can repeat these songs and understand the theology that is behind this religion. So what is very helpful, and what was very helpful for my research, is that the Dawes Commission records are actually available digitally. They are on Ancestry.com and various other places, I'm sure. And so they've been digitized and they are readily available for those who are interested. And so I was able to access these records and read the actual testimony of freedmen and others, and them really telling their story. So this isn't only interesting because of, kind of its connection to this history of the 5 civilized tribes, but it's just interesting to hear these people's personal stories, to hear them say, yes, I was born around such and such time. This person was my master. This is who I married. I married this woman who, is from the United States and she's my wife. Or I am from such and such place and I married this person from Texas and these are my children and I want them enrolled. And I remember when the war happened and such happened. So it's just people of African descent and indigenous, heritage telling their stories. And so it's this really rich resource that we have available to us where we can just get a window into the lives of these people. Well, what I hope people take away from this chapter is an understanding that all the efforts that AMEs put in that we looked at in chapter 6, it really comes to fruition in chapter 7. All the labor that AMEs had done over decades enabled them to then be of service to Black Indigenous people during the Dawes Commission era, helping them with their citizenship cases, and ultimately, in doing so, enabling them to acquire their land allotments and hopefully a future in which they and their families could have a more stable time. And so chapter 7, again, is really the culmination of what we've seen in the past several chapters, especially chapter 6.